Hi everybody, welcome back to English 247. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 5th of July, our last class before our final examination. So what I wanted to do is to put some closure onto incidents in the life of a slave girl. I wanted to also talk about the awakening. And if you'll see in the notes below, our due dates, that today, if you are watching this on Tuesday the 5th, at 11:59 p.m., journal number 5 for incidents in the life of a slave girl would be due. But there is just a little bit of flexibility in terms of journals and in terms of papers that I would take them up until Monday the 12th at 9 a.m. That would be paper number 2, and any outstanding journals you might have and any revisions that you might have for the first paper. Certainly try to get in that assortment before the 12th, but the 12th would be the very last day in which you could submit that. And I will be posting your final exam on Thursday, and that is on the 7th at 9 a.m. And if we were meeting in person, you would have 3 hours to take that final. But since we aren't meeting in person, you have 24 hours. That final will be due the next day, and that will be on Friday at 9 a.m., Friday the 8th. And I don't expect you to spend 24 hours, obviously, working on the final. You should spend 2 to 3 hours working on that final. Open book, open notes, series of essay questions. You can access any of the class information to help you with that. And the attendance question for today, which is going to be about the awakening, that would be due on Thursday, the 7th at 9 a.m. So, in terms of where we were talking about incidents in the life of a slave girl, and I'm always surprised that this text is not better known and that is not studied in high school curriculum, because it is as much a history lesson as it is a example of female courage and determination, something that we've talked about throughout the course of this semester. And I just wanted to point to a couple of quotes that I thought would be relevant for incidents in the life of a slave girl. And this would be in the introduction, first of all, where it talks about some of the recurring themes of the text: the struggle for freedom, the preservation of family, and the plight of Black American women. And I think we've seen the struggle for freedom and preservation of family in other texts, but we have not seen the plight of Black American women. And as we continue on, and this would also be in the beginning of the text in the introduction, it talks a little bit about how Linda Brandt, in the choice of making who she would give herself to, she became an outcast from her grandmother's goodwill, the one woman who should have been able to sympathize with her state of affairs. And once again, the matter of who had the strongest claim on one's obedience became an issue. Obedience to the master, thereby relinquishing all control of oneself. Obedience to the grandmother, this would be in Linda's case, who had no control of her own self. Or obedience to Linda's own moral conscience, which she alone could influence. And one of the things that I also talk about in the introduction is the idea of Linda Brandt spending 7 years in that garret. And in the introduction, it talks about some of the historical events that occur within those 7 years. How long can someone wait for the freedom train? In the year that Harriet Jacobs moved into this box, the Liberty Bell cracked while tolling the death of Chief Justice John Marshall. One day became 2,520 days. 2,520 days became 83 months. 19th century historical records show that Betsy Ross died in Harriet's second year of self-imposed exile. Victoria became the Queen of Great Britain in her third year. The Underground Railroad was organized while Harriet lived in her box for the fourth year. In the fifth year, the mutiny of slaves on board the Amistad ship occurred. And as American women gathered at the Worldwide Anti-Slavery Convention in London to stage a protest because they were not allowed to be seated as delegates, Harriet was in her 6th year of hiding. Nearly 7 years later, during the time that the first university degrees were granted to women in America, Harriet Jacobs successfully escaped to the north. It's an absolute incredible story of bravery and the human will. One of the things that we learn throughout the text is that while certainly Southern women didn't have the rights and privileges that men had, they certainly had more rights and privileges than black women had. And this happens in the chapter, The New Master and the Mistress. For me, this is in chapter 9, where Harriet Jacobs makes a comment about her master's wife, Mrs. Flint. And I had mentioned that Flint is such an appropriate name because he does have a heart of flint. Mrs. Flint, like many Southern women, was totally deficient in energy. She had not the strength to superintend her household affairs, but her nerves were so strong that she could sit in her easy chair and see a woman whipped till the blood trickled from every stroke of the lash. And of course, I asked you to identify a hypocritical incident in terms of this text, and there are so many. But certainly the idea of religion, which is a hypocrisy that we've examined in other texts, is something that we see in this work. But we also see the hypocrisy of the mistresses. And when in the trials of girlhood, this is chapter 5, Harriet Jacobs says on page, for me, 27, the mistress ought to protect the helpless victim, but she has no other feelings towards her than those of jealousy and rage. And she also talks about the irony that which commands admiration in the white woman, in other words, beauty, only hastens the degradation of the female slave, because now the female slave becomes a target for sexual abuse. And then we continue on that when she says, reader, and this is on page 29 in the Trials of Girlhood, but she says similar things throughout the text. It is not to awaken sympathy for myself that I'm telling you truthfully what I suffered in slavery. I do it to kindle a flame of compassion in your hearts for my sisters who are still in bondage, suffering, as I once suffered. And she continues on page 30 and says, in light of these things, why are ye silent, ye free men and women of the North? Why do your tongues falter in maintenance of the right? Would that I had more ability, but my heart is so full and my pen is so weak. There are noble men and women who plead for us, striving to help those who cannot help themselves. God bless them. God give them strength and courage to go on. God bless those everywhere who are laboring to advance the cause of humanity. And of course, many of you had indicated that the difficulty in reading this text was not necessarily in the language, but in the brutality of the incidents that occurred. And one of the things that Harriet Jacobs says is that while she certainly has sympathy and empathy for people much like herself who have been brutalized and degraded, she also urges them to stand up for themselves. And this would be in the chapter Prejudice Against Color, towards the ending of the book, on page 199. And this is chapter 35, where she says, my answer is that colored servants ought to be dissatisfied with themselves for not having too much self-respect to submit to such treatment. If you'll remember, what she found is that she was not being given tea, much like in the way that the other nannies were being given tea, was not given a seat in the way that the other nannies were given a seat, even though she was in the North. And she says, there's no difference in the price of board for colored and white servants. And there was no justification for difference of treatment. Again, note the distinction between a servant and a slave, which allows her to have more empowerment. I stayed a month after, and finding that I was resolved to stand up for my rights, they concluded to treat me well. Let every colored man and woman do this, and eventually we shall cease to be trampled under by a foot of our oppressors. But keep in mind, she had talked about earlier that, some of the slaves had been so degraded that they would even stand out of the way while their own family members were being whipped because they had lost all sense of power and all sense of honor and dignity. And we learn towards the very ending about how the second Mrs. Bruce ends up buying her freedom. And of course, we talked about that really no person can be trusted in this system. Mr. Sands is a wonderful example. He's shifty like Sands, that he does purchase Harriet's children and continually promises to offer them freedom, but that he doesn't. But at least we can say for Mrs. Bruce that she does indeed buy Harriet Jacobs or Linda Brent's freedom. And Linda Brent talks about the irony of that she's been free throughout and that her will has been free even though her body hasn't been free, but that this was necessary in order for her to have the legal status of freedom, and how unfortunate that is. As she says on page 226 in the chapter Free at Last, and this is when she says, I'm deeply grateful to the generous friend who procured my freedom, but I despise the miscreant who demanded payment for what was never rightfully his or belonged to him. And then she ends the story, this is for me on page 227 in the same chapter, saying, Reader, my story ends with freedom, not in the usual way, with marriage. And think about that statement where we've read so many texts that marriage was not necessarily a source of freedom. I and my children are now free. We are as free from the power of slaveholders as are the white people of the North. And through that, according to my ideas, and though that, according to my ideas, is not saying a great deal, it is a vast improvement in my condition. The dream of my life is not yet realized. I do not sit with my children in a home of my own. I still long for a hearthstone of my own, however humble. Keep in mind how the grandmother had her own residence and was able to purchase some of the freedom of her family members. And then Linda Brent continues, I wish it for my children's sake far more than for my own. But God so orders circumstances as to keep me with my friend Mrs. Bruce. Love, duty, gratitude also bind me to her side. It is a privilege to serve her who pities my oppressed people and who has bestowed the boon of freedom on me and, consequently, my children. So, what that leaves us with is one last text for the semester, and we end in the way that we began by reading Kate Chopin. We started with Story of an Hour, and we read a short story. Now we end with her novella, something that's longer than a short story, not quite as long as a novel, for The Awakening. And you can see in the notes below that Chopin was banned and basically ostracized after this text because it was considered so scandalous. And considering the other texts that we've read, we can definitely see how The Awakening would be scandalous, perhaps even in today's world, where we have a woman who leaves her husband and basically takes up on her own. She also leaves her children, and she begins an affair and feels guilty because she's having an affair, not because she's cheating on her husband, but because she'd rather have an affair with another man. And then when she realizes that society will never accept her definition of freedom, that she commits suicide at the ending. And it's not obvious that she commits suicide at the ending. We need to basically read between the lines where she goes swimming. Swimming is such an important metaphor in this text, where you talk about the idea of swimming as a source of independence and strength. One of the things is that Edna learns how to swim, and the idea of the water serving as a kind of womb or a place of birth or rebirth, a spiritual awakening as well as a physical awakening through her swimming, is important in terms of this text. It almost reminds me of a baptism in some respects, with her connection with water. Water can be very cleansing. But at any rate, the idea that at the ending of the novel she swims out as far as she can, and the sense that we get is that she doesn't have the strength to return back. This is a one-way trip, so that eventually she will tire and eventually she will drown, and that is how she commits suicide. But Chopin herself lived a very unorthodox life. It's not surprising considering the sorts of texts that she wrote. She was bored with parties. Think about how important parties are for something like a character and persuasion. She read literature. We know how dangerous reading can be, especially after we read The Cult of True Womanhood, and we were cautioned about the dangers of reading. She smoked cigars. That would still be considered unusual in today's world. She walked alone. The idea is that a woman should always be accompanied during this time period. And she insisted on privacy. And think about how we're having some of these debates right now in our contemporary times about female and privacy in terms of health issues. She dressed unconventionally. She ran the family plantation after her husband's death. Reportedly, she had a very good relationship with her husband and that he encouraged this sense of independence. Yet we see in her work, she oftentimes wrote from a different perspective, whether she was writing from a different perspective because of some of her issues or because of other issues that female in general would experience that she could observe that were different from her own. And we see the themes of self-assertion, repressed sexuality, and independence, something that we've seen in other texts this semester, but not necessarily as obvious, as overt as what we see here. And we see the intellectual, emotional, physical, and sexual awakening of female. And that also is still, in our own time, a sort of taboo subject, the idea of female sexuality. And the first book, I noticed that it's divided up into several books. We get the imagery of a caged bird. This is very Kate Chopinish, as we talked about with Story of an Hour. She oftentimes talks about birds as symbols for female, that they have the ability to fly and be free, but they're oftentimes entrapped in a cage. This particular bird speaks an incomprehensible language. It's a parrot. And says, "Get out." And this is so wonderful because it's a representation of Edna being trapped in the cage, and nobody understands what she's saying, even though she needs to get out. And we learn that she is on vacation with her husband, and when she goes into the water, she takes off her wedding rings, which is a wonderful symbol, too, for achieving a level of freedom when she's in the water that is not connected to her husband. In book 3, we're told that her husband is rather disappointed that she isn't more interested in his concerns and not more attentive to the children. In other words, she's not a mother woman, as other women are during this text, in this text. And that he would actually look forward to leaving the family to work in the city during the week while they were on vacation, because that gave him something to do. Again, the importance of work as self-fulfillment, something that was denied to female, as well as the importance of work for financial independence, which was also denied to female. In book 4, we learn about Madame Ratignolle, and she's very different from Edna. She's very much the mother woman. For her, selecting a bonbon that might be too rich and could hurt her is risky behavior. Think about that in the context of the behavior that Edna engages in over the course of the story. And in book 4 and 5, we're told about the sea being this kind of seductive force. After all, it does go in and out. And it's also very symbolic of the womb, as I had indicated, that it cleanses, it rejuvenates, it caresses, and it offers freedom and escape. And Edna here is where she begins to realize her position as she calls it, an independent being, something that was denied female in the 1800s. And we could say that perhaps is denied female in our own time period. In book 7, Edna removes her collar and opens her dress at the throat, and this is a sign of freedom. We'll see lots of different signs of this. For instance, when she's so hungry, she's basically hungry for life, for instance. She has a passionless marriage to Mr. Pontellier. It was very much a good match if you think about what we learned in terms of persuasion, and a way to rebel a bit against her family because of the different religious backgrounds between herself and her husband. And she says she was fond in an uneven way of her children, which very much flies in the face of the idea of the mother woman. We learn about a Mademoiselle Reisz. She's very different. Mademoiselle Reisz is very much single and defiant against the constructs of society. She plays music, the piano, and in fact, she plays Chopin's music. Little pun here. Here, we're not talking about Kate Chopin. We're talking about the musician Chopin. And Edna is stuck by the passion of the music. In other words, we see Edna's passion awakening for everything during the course of this novel. In the 10th book is where we learn that Edna is able to swim and she has independence and power. Note that all the men are taking credit for this rather than giving her credit for her learning. In book 11, Edna and her husband have a battle of wills over who will go inside the house first. And that's a symbol of control. Mr. Pontellier wins, at least this particular battle. In book 13, Edna has a sensual awakening before a nap while stretching out in bed. She's very aware of her body and her physicality. This is where she's hungry, both literally and figuratively. In book 15, Edna is upset that Robert is leaving town because she basically, on her holiday, has met Robert and is having more and more feelings for him. And he's having feelings for her, which is why he's leaving town, because he realizes that they could never have a relationship because she's married. And if they did have a relationship, it would mean the destruction of their reputations. This is where she realizes that she's infatuated with Robert, which moves to basically love. And in book 16, Edna says, and this I think is a very important quote, that she would never sacrifice herself to anyone, not even her children, although she would give up her life for them. Think about how this is foreshadowing for the ending when she commits suicide. That giving up her life, even though she's told that's the ultimate sacrifice, no, it isn't. It's giving up her will. That's the ultimate sacrifice. Something that we've talked about as well with Harriet Jacobs and Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. In book 17, Edna is refusing to take callers. Again, think about the life of the characters in Persuasion, the importance of keeping up social dictates. She's supposed to take callers on Tuesday afternoon. She won't do it. And not only that, there's an episode with her talking to her husband about it over dinner. He keeps seasoning his bland soup. And in other words, the soup is a representation of his bland life. And Edna tries to throw away her wedding ring, of course, which is a symbol not just of marriage, but for her entrapment. But the maid returns it to her. And again, think about the kind of life that one has when one has a maid, as opposed to something like Harriet Jacobs, who's hidden in a garret for 7 years because she's a slave. And in book 18, Edna says she doesn't envy the domestic harmony of the Ragtignolis, that instead she really wants to be an independent person. And in book 19, Mr. Pontellier, her husband, is shocked and angered that Edna is disregarding her duties as a wife and mother. She's let basically the housekeeping go, and his first thought is perhaps she's mentally unstable. So again, think about how easy it is to sort of classify a female as, quote, crazy, unquote, if she doesn't follow the dictates of society. And then in book 21, Edna learns that Robert is actually writing letters to Mademoiselle Reisz, where he's not writing letters to her, but he's confessing to, or at least showing Mademoiselle Reisz in his letters, that Edna is a very important person in his mind. This is where in book 22, Mr. Pontellier decides to visit a physician because of his wife, because she's making him, quote, uncomfortable, unquote. And the doctor, being rather astute, is wondering if another man is involved, but out of decorum, he decides he's not going to raise his concerns out loud. He wouldn't want to offend anyone or implicate someone unjustly. In book 23, Edna is happy that her husband is oftentimes at work, because if he were home, they wouldn't have anything to say to one another. Again, this shows that this is more of a marriage of convenience rather than intellectual equals, which goes to show how Jane Eyre's marriage was so different to Rochester. And then in book 24, Edna's father even thinks that Edna's behaving poorly, and he thinks Mr. Pontellier, her husband, is just being too lenient with Edna. Meanwhile, Edna is enjoying her solitude and the leisure to read. Again, the importance of reading. Imagine if Harriet Jacobs could not read or write. She could never have given us the story that she gave us. And then Edna starts spending time with her new male friend in chapter 25, Alcee Arobin, who's infatuated with her. And Edna's first thought is, what would Robert think of her new relationship? She doesn't wonder about what her husband would think of the relationship. In book 26, Edna decides to rent her own place and to move into a small house, which she calls a pigeon house. And think of that bird imagery. Around the corner that she can afford on her own. So she can be financially independent because she has a small inheritance and income she generates from selling her own sketches. And Edna is at this point very pleased to hear Robert is returning. This is where she admits that she loves him. And then in 27, Edna admits she knows her character would be viewed as wicked, but that isn't going to stop her actions. And Arobin kisses her and she feels passion. In fact, we could even think about her character as wicked in today's world, because while certainly I think we can empathize and understand her desire for independence from marriage is something that we saw with Mrs. Mallard. But note that Mrs. Mallard didn't have children, and children are involved in this text, which gives us a whole different dynamic. Edna and Arobin consummate their relationship, but she regrets her lover isn't Robert. And this is in chapter 28. And then in chapter 30 is when Edna turns 29. This is a very pivotal life stage year, the transition from the ending of the 20s and moving into the 30s, especially for female, where female oftentimes, once she hits the decade of the 30s, is thought of being not necessarily as attractive or not necessarily as important even. And especially in this time period, though you could say that in today's world as well on some levels. In book 32, Mr. Pontellier learns of his wife's intentions to move out. His major concern is that the neighbors will think they're experiencing a financial failure. I can't help but think of Sir Walter Elliot in Persuasion, the importance of appearances. And then in book 33, Robert returns to town and he sees Arobin's picture at Edna's house and he becomes jealous. This is when chapter 36, Edna kisses Robert and they admit their love for one another. But then Edna is summoned to Madame Ratignolle's for another birth. Again, she's one of these mother women. And although Edna is not really needed there, Ratignolle wants her there so that she can tell Edna to think of the children. In other words, people are beginning to observe that ultimately Edna is living more for her own desires rather than for the benefit of her family. This is in chapter 37. And then in chapter 38, Edna returns home. She's coming back to Robert, or so she thought, but he left a note saying goodbye because he loves her, and that he's leaving her because he loves her, because he knows that they can't realistically have a relationship. And this is where we get to the ending of the book in chapter 39, where Edna cannot sacrifice herself for her children. So she undresses. Think about the idea of the freedom associated with being nude, and goes into the sea naked until she is exhausted and drowns. Think about the similarities also with the story of An Hour, that it seems that female can only achieve a certain level of freedom through death. And of course, as a reader, we're supposed to rail against that. The idea is that how do we change society so that isn't necessarily the case? And a couple of quotes that I just wanted to draw your attention to. In The Awakening, she talks about an indescribable oppression. This is in the third book. For me, this is on page 6. An indescribable oppression which seemed to generate in some unfamiliar part of her consciousness filled her whole being with a vague anguish. And perhaps we can say that that's the case of all of the females that we've read about over the course of this semester. Even someone like Elizabeth in Frankenstein, I can't imagine that she would be terribly happy with Victor basically leaving her and not explaining the reasons why. And as we continue on, another quote that I wanted to draw your attention to, which would be in book 6, and for me, page 14. In short, Mrs. Pontellier was beginning to realize her position in the universe as a human being and to recognize her relations as an individual to the world within and about her. This might seem like a ponderous weight of wisdom to descend upon the soul of a young woman of 28. Perhaps more wisdom than the Holy Ghost is usually pleased to vouchsafe for any woman. And this is where we also hear that the voice of the sea is seductive, never ceasing, whispering, clamoring, murmuring, inviting the soul to wander for a spell in abysses and solitude, to lose itself in mazes of inward contemplation. The voice of the sea speaks to the soul. The touch of the sea is sensuous, enfolding the body in its soft, close embrace. Or sensuous. The touch of the sea is sensuous, enfolding the body in its soft, close embrace. And then later on, and for me, this would be page 51, and this would be in chapter 16, where she talks about that her whole life, she'd been accustomed to harbor thoughts and emotions which never harbored or never voiced themselves. They had never taken the form of struggles. They belonged to her and were her own. She entertained the conviction that she had a right to them, and that they concerned no one but herself. Edna had once told Madame Ratignolle that she would never sacrifice herself for her children or for anyone. Then had followed a rather heated argument. The two women did not appear to understand each other, to be talking the same language. Think about the beginning with the parrot who's misunderstood and speaking in another language. Edna tried to appease her friend, to explain. I would give up the unessential. I would give up money. I would give up my life for my children. But I wouldn't give up myself. I can't make it more clear. It's only something which I am just beginning to comprehend. And of course, we see at the ending what that means. And on page 71, this is when Mr. Pontellier is consulting a doctor about Edna's behavior. This is in chapter 22. The doctor's advice is, let your wife alone for a while. Don't bother her and don't let her bother you. Woman, my dear friend, is a very peculiar and delicate organism. A sensitive and highly organized woman, such as I know Mrs. Pontellier to be, is especially peculiar. It would require an inspired psychologist to deal successfully with them. And when ordinary fellows like you and me attempt to cope with their idiosyncrasies, the result is bungling. Most women are moody and whimsical. This is some passing whim of your wife, due to some cause or causes which you and I needn't try to fathom. But it will pass happily over, especially if you let her alone. Send her around to see me. And then, of course, afterwards, the doctor thinks to himself. The doctor would have liked during the course of conversation to ask, is there any man in the case? But he knew his Creole too well to make such a blunder as that. And again, Kate Chopin sets her text in Louisiana and the Creole world. He did not resume his book immediately, but sat for a while meditating, looking out into the window. And then, of course, the doctor is thinking, oh, I hope it's not what I think it is, another man. And perhaps we can end the awakening by thinking about the quote where Edna is basically at the ending of the novel. This is chapter 36. And where she's saying basically after she's kissed him, that I always feel sorry. Or this is right before she kissed him. I always feel sorry for women who don't like to walk. They miss so much, so many rare little glimpses of life. And we women learn so little of life on the whole. And of course, the awakening is about learning about life. And I hope that for you, this class was a bit of an awakening as well about the role of female in the 1800s and the way things have differed and also remain the same in our current time period. And that basically is the conclusion to our Women in Literature class. Our attendance question, which would be due on Thursday the 7th at 9 a.m., which is when I will be posting our final exam question or questions. But your attendance question, your last attendance question is, what do you think is the most scandalous act in the awakening and why? What do you think is the most scandalous act in the awakening and why? There are quite a few scandalous acts in this text, obviously. And what's left is for me to thank you for taking this class in one of the perhaps most challenging times in our history. Sadly, I've been saying that for a good 2+ years now to my classes, and it seems that the challenges only increase rather than decrease. But I understand that we are in a very unique time period, but yet we continue on as well as we can. So I appreciate very much your time and your attention. So for one last time, I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And I will post the final exam Thursday, 9 a.m. Take care. Bye-bye.